You notice how lately on the channel my videos seem to just be getting longer and longer and longer as I get a little more comfortable just yapping on and on to the camera? Well, today I'm going to try and talk about 7 different mouthpieces without dragging it out forever. Let's see if I can accomplish that goal. I think I'll be aided by the fact that they all at least say 3C on them, even if they are not all the same. Let's dive into it. It's now been close to 5 years since I did a video on the channel where I compared 7 different 7C trumpet mouthpieces to each other. I had initially picked out the 7C video because, for one thing, I had access to multiple different 7Cs, and for another thing, it's considered so ubiquitous in the broader band community that trumpet players start on 7Cs that it really is interesting, and it's not quite a secret in the advanced trumpet community, but the fact that 7Cs really aren't consistent between brands, like a Bach and a Giardinelli 7C have virtually nothing to do with each other, and furthermore, even different eras of manufacture play a role in it. So a New York Bach 7C plays differently from a Mount Vernon 7C, which plays very differently from either an older or a more modern Elkhart 7C. And it's an absolute nightmare to try and make sense of it all, but the funny thing is, I don't think the 7C is even the most egregious offender here. I think the 3C might edge it out for the top spot, to be completely honest with you. I wanted to start this off with a discussion of what should a 3C be, and even that is truly fraught with difficulty, and the reason I say that the 3C might even be worse of an offender as far as being super inconsistent between brands is not necessarily because of the disagreement, say, between Bach and Giardinelli, or between Giardinelli and Olds, or between Olds and Conn, or anything like that. It's more so just the fact that the idea of the nominal 3C is so widely disagreed upon. Normally, I would consult the Bach manual and take that sort of at face value, since Bach was the one that devised this number-letter system where a smaller number translates to a wider cup, and the letters from A to F are deep to shallow. If it was just as simple as that, yeah, I'd have no problem looking at the Bach manual for any of this information. But the 3 is where some interesting stuff starts to happen. Normally, when I talk about mouthpieces, I like to talk about the inner diameter measurement. Basically, if you take a cross-section of the cup, it's from this wall to that wall. How wide is that point? Usually best expressed either in millimeters or in hundredths or thousandths of an inch. For instance, the 1.5 Cs that I tend to play on are supposed to clock in at 17 millimeters or 0.67 of an inch. 3Cs are a more complex matter because if you look at the Bach catalog, it says that a 3C should only be 16.3 millimeters across the cup. And that is really strange because when you consider that a 7C is marked 16.2 and a 5C is marked 16.25, and then the 3 is a 16.3, then you have this massive jump from that to 1.5 at 17. That's really not accurate. I think some of Bach's nominal measurements are accurate, like the 7 and the 1 measurements. They make a decent amount of sense. But when you think about the 3C landing at 16.3 supposedly, it's just ludicrous. I think a much more commonly accepted answer, particularly if you look at things like the trumpet mouthpiece comparator, is that the typical Bach 3C, even some of the older ones that tended a little bit smaller, really tend to clock in larger than 16.5, honestly. More like 16.6 to 16.8. I think 16.75 would be a nice middle ground for them all to land at, just because that's 0.66 of an inch approximately. I know Schilke and Yamaha 14s and GR 66s, which are based on that 0.66 inch measurement, and that's how they get their name. They are fairly equivalent to the modern Bach 3C. But like I said, it's really not consistent from one Bach to the next, either between or sometimes even within eras. Let's just assume for the purposes of discussion moving forward that 3Cs are supposed to nominally clock in at 0.66 of an inch. Let's just accept that for the time being. We can deal more with that later if we have time for it. The cup is also a little bit of a wrinkle. Something to know about Bach's mouthpiece line is that although Vincent Bach coined this alphanumeric line of mouthpieces that is supposed to have these clearly observable and easy to follow and intuitive sorts of trends, it's not that simple because a lot of Bach's early models were models specifically geared towards certain artists who were looking for certain specs or certain qualities in their playing. There came a time where he tried to standardize those mouthpieces and put them all under this alphanumeric roof. And that's where we start to run into issues because normally I would talk about the cup depth of the 3C and I would say, oh, it's a standard C cup, it's a middle of the road depth. Here's the funny thing. At least for modern 3Cs, I don't know as much about New York or Mount Vernon 3Cs, they ride quite a bit shallower than basically any other C in the Bach catalog. And this warrants its own video. Maybe I'll do one on that someday. Basically, no two Bach C cups are exactly the same in terms of depth. The trouble here being the 3C's C cup is just about as shallow as a C can justifiably be. In fact, if you were to go to the trumpet mouthpiece comparator and you were to look at some of the 3s versus 7s, you'd see a 3C is slimmer in some ways than a Bach 7D. And the 7E is not that much shallower than the 3C. It's really, really bizarre, especially once you look at the 3E and you see how comically shallow that is. Point being, all of Bach's 3-letter cups ride a little bit shallower. And furthermore, it's not just the depth of the 3C necessarily, but the shape too. The 3C is a little bit more V-shaped than Bach's other C cups, where instead of having a full bowl like this, which like the 1C for instance is famous for, you have these sort of slimmed outsides where the cup tapers in a little bit quicker, and then you get to the point of having a vaguely C-ish depth by having a very relaxed throat entrance, a lot of room at the bottom of the cup, but the top of the cup is fairly slim. That's one of the distinctive features of the 3C that I guess gives it its signature sound. I hear a lot of 3C players sound a certain way, and I think it is the shape of that cup being a little bit more efficient that causes that sort of bright, straight-ahead tone. So at this point, I've attempted to type the 3C as a 0.660-inch inner diameter, medium to medium shallow, semi-V sort of cup, and that's not always the case, but that's at least a decent jumping off point for us, I hope. At least the majority of the 3Cs on the trumpet mouthpiece comparator that have been scanned in and submitted look kind of like that. At this point now, let's introduce our contestants and see what we're working with, and then we'll listen to each of them in turn and see what we can discern from there. We have a couple different Bach 3Cs with us today, and the main one for the purposes of this comparative analysis is this one stamped Vincent Bach Corp 3C. It's got a fairly large dot following Corp, and so that dates it back to around the 1970s. I got a really good deal for this on eBay, and I've been using it actually quite a bit since then. If you can believe it, it's my pet band mouthpiece, and that's for a couple reasons. This is an oversized Bach 3C. I mentioned that the diameter in the book is 16.3, and a lot of them end up being somewhere in between 16.5 and 16.8. When I measure this, to the best of my abilities, it is basically 17 millimeters. This is basically a 1.5C rim and inner diameter with a 3C style cup on it. I would really need to do a separate video analyzing just Bach 3Cs to kind of talk about the different types of 3C that Bach has manufactured, but point being, the cup at the very least on this thing is pretty benchmark as far as 3Cs go. I also thought I'd showcase this cornet mouthpiece, which is also a Bach, but it says Corp Mount Vernon 3C. And the Mount Vernon pieces are highly sought after. I got this one completely by accident with the purchase of one of my cornets that I've actually since sold. I liked this mouthpiece, did not like that cornet. That's a long story for another time. But I wanted to showcase this Mount Vernon, even if it's not a one-to-one comparison when I stick this cornet to trumpet adapter on this mouthpiece and then stick it into my trumpet, because, you know, backbore geometry is a weird thing here. It was interesting to sort of compare just the feel of this Mount Vernon to a later 3C. Now, the Blessing Company is famous for basically taking Bach designs, copying them to the best of their ability, and offering them at slightly more affordable prices than Bach. And so I have a Blessing 3C here that I was curious to see how it would stack up to a standard Bach counterpart. And it's definitely not the same dimensions as my Corporation 3C. Like I mentioned, that one's an oversized 3C. This one feels like a more of a nominal 3C, a little bit more rim flatness and a little bit less inner diameter. So they may have based this on something more like the Mount Vernon 3C. I think a lot of these German and Chinese Bach copycats, they tend to use Mount Vernon blueprints for theirs, even if they don't use the exact same metal or the exact same cutters or anything. They take the specs from the Mount Vernon era and try and convert them to a modern mouthpiece. Now here's an interesting one. This is the CKB 3C, more specifically their Acousti-Balance series. CKB is the merger of Conn, King, and Benge, and for a while they've been producing mouthpieces with this really unusual blank shape, where the body of the mouthpiece seems to go a little bit farther down. You have this fun ornate ring, and then you have an extra little bit of mass down here. And they've supposedly done this, as based on the name Acousti-Balance, to sort of balance out the playing experience with these mouthpieces, where you get some of the properties of a heavyweight mouthpiece, like a Schilke heavyweight, a Denis Wick heavy top, or a Bach megatone, but with supposedly more streamlined results so that it doesn't feel as different to play from, you know, a standard blank mouthpiece. And this is a really interesting one. I definitely like to play on this one. It's one of my more favored non-Bach 3Cs, but we'll talk more about that later. Now, I mentioned Denis Wick. Denis Wick is a company in the UK that has some of the same sizes in their trumpet catalog as Bach, but their mouthpieces feel very, very different to play. And this is my friend's Denis Wick 3C, which I asked if I could borrow for this video, just because I was really curious as to how it would differ. He says that he personally prefers the Denis Wick 3C over the Bach 3C, even though he doesn't use this mouthpiece anymore. Denis Wick's trumpet mouthpieces tend towards flatter rims, and I would say slightly shallower cups. This looks pretty shallow and V-shaped, but like I said, that's not too much of a departure from the typical Bach 3C, unlike most of his C cups. Now, I mentioned Giardinelli in my intro, and I do have a Giardinelli New York era 3C, and I bought this thing actually specifically for this video, and I fully intend to sell it because I don't like how it plays for me personally. And it is so different from the modern Giardinelli 3C that I had for a while and sold. That was a really nice sort of sizzly big band size, kind of the same thing that I would get out of my Corporation 3C. This thing though, oh gosh, the New York sizes, they are huge. If you look on the mouthpiece comparator, a New York Giardinelli 3C is actually in some ways a little bit larger than a Bach 1C. It is truly stupendously large. The inner diameter is right up there with the Bach 1 1/4 or 1, depending on the exact model of 3 you've got. And Giardinelli's C cup is quite deep. I mentioned that the 1C is one of Bach's deeper C cups, but this is deeper still. It's ridiculous. And then last up today, we have the Olds 3C, which has this interesting shape here. It looks like it might be a little bit heavy, kind of like a Bach megatone, but it's actually not that much heavier than a standard Bach blank. The weight's just kind of concentrated up more towards the top. And this, like the CKB, is one of my favorite non-Bach takes on the 3C. It definitely fits into that camp of fairly wide inner diameter and fairly pronounced roundness to the rim, so not too much flatness or inner edge going on, and that's something that I like to see from 3Cs. This one is, you know, a good blend of the characteristics that I like, even if it's not quite as 1.5C like as my Bach Corporation 3C. For your listening pleasure today, I've got a couple different excerpts on which I'm going to demo all of these 3C marked mouthpieces so we can talk about some comparisons. First things first, I'm just going to play you a little ballad out of the Arbin's Art of Phrasing, something I'm trying to incorporate more into my routine these days. And then I'm going to demo them all on a more technical lick from Alfred Reed's El Camino Real, which the Gonzaga University Wind Ensemble just played. I was playing French horn for that performance, but it didn't stop me from learning the trumpet and cornet parts on the side. So enjoy. There are a couple of more targeted pairs that I want to talk about, and then some general observations that I'd like to mention. First things first, I told you it wasn't really a one-to-one comparison because of this thing going on here, but it was really interesting to me to observe the difference between the Elkhart and the Mount Vernon Bach pieces. There definitely was a difference going on, and like I said, this backboard geometry is really stupid because you've got a big step down to this open adapter here where the cornet mouthpiece stops inserting, and so there's a lot more volume inside that backboard than you would typically have with basically any trumpet mouthpiece. But that aside, these two do play fairly differently. Like I said, this one's a little bit roomier inner diameter wise. This one is closer to that sort of what I would call like 16.7 millimeters. But nonetheless, the Mount Vernon played significantly darker and a little bit lower on the pitch, where the pitch didn't start kind of raising itself up at the top of the staff the way I found the 3C from the Corporation days did on like a high G. And it was interesting to see how the two compared to each other. I feel almost more secure on the Mount Vernon, but I feel like I can do more on the Corporation. And as far as either Bach versus the Blessing, I found the partial control on the Blessing surprisingly harder than I expected to. I've played some Blessing mouthpieces that felt and sounded virtually indistinguishable from their Bach counterparts, and if anything, this Blessing 3C has a nicer concert tone to some extent than some brighter sounding Bach 3Cs like this Corporation one. So this was honestly a little bit on the darker side, but the slots just weren't as defined as I would like them to be. The types of trumpets that I play on already have fairly loose slots to begin with, so I like a mouthpiece that'll lock in a little bit more assertively, and I was just fracking and bending notes more than I expected to on the Blessing, frankly. Now, this didn't end up being the best or fairest comparison because I ended up playing the olds last in the lineup both times, and so both times I was pretty fatigued by the time I got to it. I was pretty much single taking everything. And so getting to the olds last in line, my playing maybe wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, but the olds and the Corporation 3C perform very similarly to each other, where they both have this kind of rounded rim and that shallower, more V-shaped cup, where you can get a nice concert tone out of it if you make a concerted effort in that direction, but it can really sing or soar or even punch through walls. The first time I tried an olds 3C, I was pretty amazed at how versatile it was, but how it managed to keep a bright and commanding tone through all of its different uses and parts of the dynamic spectrum and whatnot. And that's a quality I don't typically look for in a trumpet mouthpiece, but if I'm specifically looking for that, like let's say playing principal in a really heavy wind ensemble, where it's a big ensemble, you've got a lot of heavy contemporary music, this is actually not a bad thing to look into. Now granted, this Corporation 3C is probably point blank period my favorite 3C I've ever played, and I now no longer look at the olds through such a rose-tinted lens, but nonetheless, this is a pretty good 3C. The Denis Wick honestly was probably brighter than either of those two, but I didn't like the performance I got out of it, frankly. If you're the type of player who can play on flat rims, or the type of player who naturally has a little bit of a dead sound or a little bit too dark or lacking in resonance, this is perfect. It will liven up your tone. And I've played a Denis Wick 3E that surprisingly didn't liven up my tone as much as the Bach 3E does. And so I was very surprised at how much the 3C was doing in that regard. But nonetheless, for one thing, it was overkill for me, and for another thing, I can't play flat rims. I've mentioned that there are a couple of different types of Bach 3C that seem to come out of the factory. Some of them have this type of slightly flatter rim and slightly thicker, and I do not like those, whereas my Corporation 3C, shocker, it's my favorite 3C, has a very rounded rim with a high point more on the outside, so it doesn't feel like the inner diameter is as squared in as something like this. And then we have the darker of the 3Cs. I suppose I should include the Mount Vernon in this camp, but to be honest, I'm not going to talk about tone too much on the Mount Vernon. I'm going to specifically focus on the CKB and the Giardinelli. Now, if you know me, you know I like a dark tone, and you know I like roomy equipment. But what I'll say is the CKB, being substantially smaller and more 3C sized than the Giardinelli, worked a lot better for me. Like I said, the CKB 3C is one of my favorites that isn't a Bach. It has a little bit too much flatness on the rim for my liking, and it is around that nominal 1675 size and not exactly the 17 that I like to play on, but it is a very efficient sort of size. I think it's got a little bit more bowl to it, so it doesn't brighten up quite as much as the Bach 3C, and also this heavier weight here, especially concentrated down at the bottom of the mouthpiece, kind of like a Denis Wick heritage, having a thin rim but then a fat body coming down from it. I think it has a really nice effect where you get some of the heavier qualities, as in more of the frequencies are transferred to the lead pipe. You're losing out on less of the low and mid frequencies, thus resulting in a fuller or, contentiously speaking, darker sound, and so this does end up being one of the darker 3Cs, but it's not excessive at all. The response is still there. It's a tiny bit more sluggish than, a standard weight blank, but it's still completely manageable to play on, and I really enjoy this mouthpiece. The Giardinelli, I don't particularly enjoy. First things first, the pitch center and the pitch tendencies are so much lower and saggier than any of the other 3Cs that I was fighting the mouthpiece as I was playing it. Towards the top of the staff, especially if I tried to go above the staff, I would get sound, but the sound would be thinner and flatter than any of the others. It's just a pig. I don't frankly play on a lot of Bach 1-sized stuff. For a while I was playing on 1Ds and 1Es fairly often, and there are certain 1Cs or even 1s that I like, particularly for cornet playing, but honestly you're not going to see me typically using a 1C or a 1B on trumpet, and when I try to use this, it just doesn't quite work the way I would like it to. Now, to put my love for specifically this Bach Corporation 3C in context a little bit better, I'd like to talk about some of my current equipment preferences and day-to-day struggles and how that factors into me using this mouthpiece, sometimes in some pretty unexpected ways. For a long time now, I have preferred the playing experience and the sound of deeper cups. If you've been a fan of the channel for any length of time, you've heard me say 1,001 times that my main mouthpiece forever, for almost 8 years now, which is 2/3 of the time I've been playing, is a one-off Bach Megatone 1.5A. It's not an official size in the catalog. You will not find another one basically anywhere. It is a one-of-a-kind design that somebody wanted and then decided they didn't like and dropped on eBay for pretty cheap, and I picked that up my sophomore year of high school, a few months after I changed my embouchure, because I was really struggling in the low register and I wanted to experiment with a little bit of a deeper cup. At that point, I'd been playing on a stock 1.5C, and I wanted to see what a deeper cup could do for me. And I liked that so much that I stuck with it viciously through years of high school and college, all sorts of different playing. I would sometimes change out to a different mouthpiece for really strenuous lead work, or if I wanted to beef up even more for the low register, I had other ways of achieving that, slightly wider inner diameters sometimes, or wider throats. But the thing is, I kept coming back to that 1.5A, and even today, I still use that mouthpiece an awful lot. The thing being, I feel like my physical brute strength on the instrument has waned a little bit since high school, and so sometimes I find myself working a little bit too hard to get a really vibrant tone on the 1.5A, and so, as a result, sometimes I end up using a Megatone 1.5B or 1.5C, and those are great mouthpieces as well. But because of how long I've spent playing on deeper cups, I don't like going much shallower than C if I can help it for just about anything except really, really heavy lead playing. And the thing is, because of the way I blow, thanks to my time spent on deep cups, shallow cups tend to back up on me really easily if I overblow and I don't really think about reining it in and being super clean and efficient with my playing. And this 3C is the exact level of shallowness and V-ness where I can still get away with blowing really vigorously and not have to, pay the price of swelling chops and bottoming out and everything like that. But it still gives me a little bit of a crispness and endurance boost in the upper register. And so this, of all things, has ended up being my pep band and commercial horn section mouthpiece. I pair this thing very often with my Constellation 38B, which is a very bright sounding trumpet, and it's good for things like pep band and commercial horns because it can play really stinking loud and is really stinking effective at playing high. But the point is not the horn, the point is this 3C, this particular Bach Corporation 3C from the 1970s, just agrees with me when I try and play super loud and super high for extended periods of time. It can work for other types of playing as well. It just surprisingly does a very good job there. And so this thing is almost a lead mouthpiece for me. And I think most Bach 3Cs end up that way, where they're bright enough and tight enough where they are bordering on lead for me. For a long time, I thought the Bobby Shew jazz mouthpiece was a great introductory lead mouthpiece, but it turns out it's basically just a Bach 3C. So I think for the majority of players, it's not really a lead piece, and I think a lot of people play on the Bobby Shew lead model specifically because that's more geared towards it. I don't like the Bobby Shew lead. I can't play on it at all, personally. It's like if you give me a Schilke 13A4A or 14A4A, even the 15A4A, I don't sound good on any of those, and I certainly don't sound good on the Shew lead. But the Shew Jazz, much like this particular Corporation 3C, is just lead enough where I absolutely love it. As far as the most well-rounded award, I would probably give that either to a Bach Megatone 3C or this CKB 3C. I really enjoy the properties of heavyweight mouthpieces. I know they're not for everybody, but I think the CKB specifically is slimmer and the blank is a little bit more refined in such a way that you're not going to feel the effects so much as, a Bach or a Schilke heavyweight blank. And so this, if one comes up online and you want to give it a try, is definitely an option worth considering if you're looking for just a tiny bit more fullness in your sound than a Bach 3C would offer. Now, as far as just the sheer best, I don't know if I like it in terms of the feel, but the way it plays and its constants through the register and the depth of sound you get out of it, this Mount Vernon is truly something special. It was, for me, one of those you have to try it to believe it kind of things, because I'd heard forever, you know, that the Mount Vernon 3C was the holy grail of all mouthpieces, and I'd seen them go online for, on the low end, $250 to $300, sometimes $400 to $500, depending on if they were in good, unaltered condition. And the whole time I thought, what possibly could be so special about that dang Mount Vernon 3C that you're going to charge, you know, 5-6 times what a new Bach mouthpiece costs? I kind of understand it. I'm not the type of person to buy into hype if I can help it at all. I'm very hype resistant. But definitely this cornet Mount Vernon 3C, by the way, mint unaltered condition. Amazing. Totally lucked out on that. Really is something else. I've tried it on cornets. I've now tried it on a trumpet by way of an adapter. And it really has an interesting blend of qualities where it plays bigger than it actually is. You know, it feels really comfy, and I feel secure playing on it even as a 1.5C player, whereas if I played a more modern Bach that was this exact set of specs, I don't know that I would like it so much. But there's something about the Mount Vernon, I think probably there was a little bit more lead in the metal used at this time, that just gives it this really nice, rich, soft sound. It feels constant through all the dynamics, where you're not getting a super edgy tone at the loud dynamics, and the tone isn't fluffing out super easily at the quiet dynamics. It really is just an amazing blend of characteristics that, you know, I'm a little mad that I understand where the hype is coming from, but I do really like this Mount Vernon, and I'm really thankful that it just turned up in one of the cases of one of the cornets I bought. And to round things off, I'll give this stupid Giardinelli the Best Orchestral Second Trumpet Award. If you want to honk low notes all day and you don't ever want to go above a high C, sure, find a Giardinelli New York era 3C. It really is strange. I know that the new Giardinelli 3Cs are not faithful at all to the New York specifications that Bob Giardinelli himself devised, but after I'd experienced the glory that was the modern Giardinelli 3C, and I don't like to say that, you know, a stencil Chinese-made mouthpiece is that amazing, but it really was good. This thing just was so far from working for me in any capacity that I was kind of amused, if anything. And I just have to stress, you're hearing this from Mr. Bach 1.5A himself. I've been playing on that A cup like a bonehead for 2/3 of the time I've been playing this instrument. And yet, this, not even being quite as deep, but being wider and just having that huge bowl shape where the sides of the cup are so massive that the internal volume is just insurmountable, it just did not work for me. I hope that somebody can put this to better use than I can. This mouthpiece deserves to get used because it's an old Giardinelli New York, and, you know, those are fairly highly coveted in some circles, but it's not going to be me who uses it, that's for certain. I set out for this to be a shorter video, and I think I failed at that, but I suppose we'll see. That was a comparison of 7 different 3C mouthpieces. I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned something along the way. Like I said, I don't think I'm done making 3C related content. I think I really have to spend some more time talking specifically about the Bach 3C to feel a little bit of edification about this. I actually have access to one other Corporation 3C that is quite different from my fave back there. So I think just those 2 Corporation 3Cs compared together might make for an interesting video. We'll see if I get around to making that. There is so much coming off of this discussion that I want to talk about. I want to do a discussion of Bach C cups and how they vary from model to model. I want to do those 2 Bach Corporation 3Cs pitted against each other. I want to go into more depth on that Mount Vernon 3C and show off how it plays actually on some different cornets the way it was intended to be. There's so much I want to talk about, but we'll have to save that for another time. If you want to see more Mouthpiece Spotlight videos until the next one comes out, you can go to the playlist in the top right corner in the card. I appreciate you sticking around through all my rambling, and until next time, we'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.